Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Our Parasha this week is Ki Tisa. How many of you are following along on our weekly email to see what our Parasha is and to notice the scripture readings? If you're not doing it, I hope you will, so that we can all read along ahead of time, and so when we come to our worship service, it will be something familiar to you. Ki Tisa means when you take, and it's referring to taking a census of men over 20, as Rabbi Herb said, by paying a half shekel ransom for his soul. Now, we're not going to discuss this further today, but as I was looking at this, I came across some very interesting information. The Palestinians of Israel constantly make a big to-do about it being their land. I know that's no surprise to anybody here. And they say that there's no evidence of an ancient Jewish presence there. But there is a book entitled Palestina ex monumentis veneribus illustrata. I hope I pronounced that right. Written by Hadriani Rilandi, and it was published in 1714. Now, this man was a geographer, he was a map maker, he spoke perfect Hebrew, he spoke Arabic, he spoke ancient Greek, and he spoke the European languages as well. His book was written in Latin, and it was the result of a 1695 sightseeing tour to Israel, which at that time was known as Palestina. And I think you all know that's a holdover of the name that was given by the Roman Emperor Hadrian after he defeated Israel in 136 CE. So it stuck. He gave it to Israel in 136, and it has lasted pretty much until Israel went back to the nation themselves. But this was much more than just a sightseeing tour, because in his travels, he surveyed approximately 2,500 places where people lived that were mentioned in the Bible or in the Mishnah. And he also mapped the land of Israel. So here are some of his findings. Not one settlement in the land of Israel had at that time a name that was of Arabic origin. And most of the settlement names originated from the Hebrew, from the Greek, from the Latin, or the Roman languages. Most of the land was empty, and the inhabitants were few in number, being mostly concentrated in the towns of Jerusalem, Akko, Sfat, Jaffa, Tiberias, and Gaza. Most of the inhabitants were Jews and the rest Christians. There were few Muslims, mostly nomad Bedouins in Shechem. And these approximately 120 Bedouins were seasonal construction and agriculture workers. There were approximately 700 Christians living in Nazareth, and about 5,000 people in Jerusalem, mostly Jews and some Christians. In Gaza, there were about 550 people, 50% Jews and the rest mostly Christians. And there in Gaza, the Jews grew and worked in their vineyards, their olive tree orchards, and their wheat fields, and the Christians worked in commerce and transportation of produce and goods. The cities of Tiberias and Sfat were mostly Jewish. Now, at this time, the land was under the control of the Ottoman Turks, who were themselves Muslims, but they were mostly absentee occupiers at this particular time in history. and they left the inhabitants to themselves. So what we see is that this book totally contradicts any modern theory claiming a Palestinian heritage or a Palestinian nation. It gives evidence that at least in 1695, the land of Israel was primarily occupied by Jews, and there was an absolute lack of presence of Arabs. The ones who have recently, in our day and time, stolen the name Palestina, the Latin name, which given to the Roman emperor, given by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, as we mentioned a moment ago. But we knew that, didn't we? It's no surprise to us. We'll return to this week's Parsha in a few minutes, but I would like to give some thought to Purim, which occurred this past Thursday. I'm not going to read or tell you the whole Megillah, but we'll focus on some of the important facts. A large part of today's celebration of Purim is a big party, but there's also a very important spiritual side to it as well. It is well known that there is no direct mention of Adonai in the book of Esther, but it's also very obvious that he is there and working behind the scenes. The outcome of the book of Esther was that the Jews of Shushan were saved from destruction because Queen Esther implored the king to spare her life and the lives of her people. Had even Haman's decree been carried out? Did I hear any boos? Had the evil Haman's decree been carried out? All Jews in Persia would have been killed, including the Jews in the land of Israel, which was also under Persian control. It is very interesting that Mordecai, Esther's guardian, was put in charge of Haman's estate. And Mordecai did not make the same mistake that his relative did many years before. In the citadel at Shushan, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 people. And I'm not going to try to pronounce Haman's son's names, so you can just read them. The 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, and then it says they slew them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now Mordecai was from the tribe of Benjamin, which is the tribe that King Saul was from. And it is recorded in 1 Samuel that Saul disobeyed Adonai by not killing King Agag, the Amalekite, and also by taking the spoils of flocks and herds. Mordecai had obviously read that account, and he did not make the same mistake as his ancient relative. In the book of Esther, Haman is listed as the son of Hammedatha, an Agagite, a descendant of King Agag, which would also make Haman an Agagite, which is an Amalekite. And a couple of weeks ago, we had the word from Adonai that said to blot out the names of the Amalekites. Mordecai refused the plunder, and he did not repeat the mistake of King Saul. It's also interesting to get an overview of the time surrounding the events of Purim. Many times when we think about this, it's just somewhere out there where we're not exactly sure where it is. But here are some of the dates. The people of the southern kingdom of Judah were taken into captivity to Babylon in either 586 or 587 BCE. And the Jews had been captives in Babylon for approximately 48 years when Babylon was defeated by Persia. Cyrus, the king of Persia, gave permission at that time for Jews to return to their homeland. And work began rebuilding the city walls and the temple not long after that. But not nearly all Jews elected to return, and many remained scattered throughout the Persian Empire, including in Shushan. So some 5 years later, in 534 BCE, the king of Persia, who at that time was Darius, ordered the work on the temple stopped. But then about 14 years later, he rescinded his order in 520 and allowed the work to continue. Now this is what we need to know today. The events of the book of Esther and the decree to kill all Jews took place some 46 years after that in 474 BCE. And that's about 112 years after the defeat of Jerusalem by Babylon. Did you realize that was that long later? Well, the fact that so many Jews remained outside the land of Israel, despite having permission to return, demonstrates at that time their overall indifference and possibly a desire not to be associated with the God of Israel. It brought troubles, and so they kind of stayed low, They laid low. Many Jews had become comfortable in Babylon, which was now controlled by Persia, and in the other Persian-controlled lands. The resistance to making Aliyah in that day has its modern counterpart today, with many Jews living comfortably outside the land of Israel, despite Adonai's call through the prophets to return. And we do see more and more returning, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to the overall number that live outside the land. Well, we don't know how many of the Jews living outside of Israel kept Shabbat. There is Jewish tradition that synagogues were formed during the exile in Babylon. Ezekiel was one of the exiles, and he prophesied from his home on the bank of the Chebar River in Tel Aviv, Babylon, not Israel. The word of Adonai came to me, saying, Son of man, as for your kinsmen, fellow exiles in the whole house of Israel, all of them are those about whom the inhabitants of Jerusalem said, keep far away from Adonai. This land has been given to us for a possession. Therefore, thus says Adonai Elohim, though I removed them far away among the nations, though I scattered them among the countries, yet for a little while I was a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. And some think that a sanctuary here in verse 16 refers to synagogues in Babylon. And there is a pretty good tradition that there were synagogues formed in Babylon. But we also know that there was a long history within the kingdom of Judah before going to Babylon that Torah was not being followed. Now, we would like to think that Israel observed Shabbat faithfully, but that doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, the whole reason that Judah was deported to Babylon was because they did not follow Torah, and they did not give the land its rest every 7 years as required in the Shemitah. You can read about that in Exodus 23. The Shemitah is the 7th year. Crops could be sown for 6 years, but the land was to rest during the 7th. And what happened here is for the preceding 90 years, Judah has not given the land its rest. And because of that, Adonai sent them into captivity 1 year for each of the 70 Shemitah years which they had failed to keep. And Jeremiah prophesied this to Judah. For thus says Adonai, after 70 years for Babylon are complete, I will visit you and fulfill my good word toward you to bring you back to this place. Well, if Judah didn't follow the rules of Shemitah, did they do any better with keeping the Shabbat? Adonai spoke about the importance of Shabbat many times throughout the Torah, including in this week's portion, Ki Tisa. Then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, Speak now to Bnei Israel, saying, Surely you must keep my Shabbatot, my Shabbats. For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, so you may know that I am Adonai who sanctifies you. Therefore you are to keep the Shabbat, because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it will die. For whoever does any work during Shabbat, that soul will be cut off from the midst of his people. Work is to be done for 6 days, but on the 7th day is a Shabbat of complete rest, holy to Adonai. Whoever does any work on the Shabbat will surely be put to death. So Bnei Israel is to keep the Shabbat, to observe the Shabbat throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and Bnei Israel forever. For in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth, and on the 7th day he ceased from work and rested. Well, at first glance, the death sentence for anyone working on Shabbat seems unreasonable to our modern sensibilities. We can't really take that in. But we have to remember that Israel was governed through a system set up by Adonai. Adonai is the one who made those rules. He gave it through Moses, and it was carried out later through the Levitical priests. And they were being taught obedience by using a harsh penalty. The death penalty for the violation of Shabbat remained in effect as long as Israel governed themselves. But it ended completely when the temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE. And after that, there was no longer a priesthood with judges who could carry out justice. So at that point and after, they were unable to enforce the laws of Torah. But in reality, after Moses' death, things changed. And Torah was not rigidly enforced. Israel was more or less given charge over themselves, and the rabbis report that very rarely was the death penalty carried out for Torah violations of any kind after the time in the wilderness. Perhaps, just perhaps, the failure of the Kohanim to carry out Adonai's instructions early contributed to a lack of fear of violating Shabbat later. Maybe if they had obeyed Adonai and carried out his instructions, their descendants would have more respect for Shabbat today. But even though the death penalty was not carried out, violation of Shabbat remained a sin, a violation of Torah. In the time of Esther, how well Shabbat was observed is not well known. So let's ask ourselves a question. What is the purpose of Shabbat? Its importance is revealed in this week's Parasha. It is a sign between me and Bnei Israel forever. For in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he ceased from work and rested. And this tells us that this special day was a permanent sign reminding Israel of her calling and her responsibility, which is one reason why Shabbat was to be taken so seriously. But another question, is Shabbat only for the Jews? Scripture indicates that it is not only for the Jews, but for all nations. Isaiah says, "Thus says Adonai, preserve justice, do righteousness, for my salvation is about to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Blessed is the one who does this, the Son of Man who takes hold of it, who keeps from profaning Shabbat, and keeps his hand from doing any evil." In these verses, Isaiah is talking about Israel. And then he continues, also the foreigners who join themselves to Adonai to minister to him and to love the name of Adonai and to be his servants, all who keep from profaning Shabbat and hold fast to my covenant. These I will bring to my holy mountain and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. These verses speak clearly to us. Adonai has said through Isaiah that Shabbat is also for the Gentiles. And he also makes it clear that after Messiah's return and rule upon the earth, that Shabbat will continue. For just as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, will endure before me, it is a declaration of Adonai, so your descendants and your name will endure. And it will come to pass that from one new moon to another, and from one Shabbat to another, all flesh will come to bow down before me, says Adonai. All flesh. But you know that here we are not making a judgment regarding the Sabbath for any other group. I'm talking to us right now. And they must make that decision for themselves. Well, in the 1st century CE and during Yeshua's lifetime, Adonai's mitzvot regarding the Shabbat were still in effect. The priesthood had the authority to carry out the death sentence, but they had not done so in many years. Soon after Israel returned from captivity, the authority of the priesthood to make rulings changed into a court system. And by the years just before the 1st century, had it developed into the Sanhedrin system, the Sanhedrin. Only the great Sanhedrin, the court of 71 members, had the authority to apply the death penalty, although it very rarely did. Sometime during the Roman occupation, Israel lost the authority to carry out the death penalty. The Jerusalem Talmud says that it happened about 40 years before the destruction of the temple. And that is probably why Caiaphas the high priest sent Yeshua to Pilate. Then Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your Torah." The Judean leaders replied, "We are not authorized to put anyone to death." Now we believe that Yeshua died in 30 CE, which was about 40 years before the destruction of the temple. And apparently at the time of Yeshua's trial, the Romans had only recently taken away this authority. But regarding Yeshua, we know that he was perfect in keeping the Torah and that he did not violate any Shabbat laws. By the first century, the oral Torah had already prescribed 39 different kinds of work, the 39 Melachot. These were all considered to be a violation of Shabbat. And they based these on what they saw to be 39 different kinds of work required to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. There were such things as carrying, weaving, plowing, sowing, and reaping. I think you remember the story that one time a group of Pharisees accused Yeshua's disciples of breaking Shabbat by reaping grain when they plucked some grain and ate it as they walked through a field. They did not violate Shabbat because they were actually permitted by Torah to eat grain from someone else's field. And they were also, ironically, actually permitted by oral law, which the Pharisees followed, to break and eat grain if it was only done with one hand. Those Pharisees, you know, were just looking for a fight. Shortly after that encounter, Yeshua also told them that the priests who worked in the temple on Shabbat did not violate Shabbat. You find that in Matthew 12:5. He said that the priests performed melachah, work which was required to enable worship. While later he went to the synagogue, a man with a withered hand was there. And so that they might accuse him, they questioned Yeshua, saying, "Is it permitted to heal on Shabbat?" He said to them, "What man among you will not grab his sheep and lift it out if it falls into a pit on Shabbat? How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? Amen. Therefore, it is permitted to do good on Shabbat." Amen. Well, let's repeat the question which I asked just a moment ago. What is the purpose of Shabbat? In the beginning, Adonai made the Shabbat holy because it was the day on which he ceased from his work of creating. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, for on it he ceased from all his work that God created for the purpose of preparing. Which day was it? The Hebrew says Yom HaShvi'i, day the seventh. Now verse 3, which we just read, says nothing about resting. In this week's Parasha, Exodus 31:14a, uses the word Shabbat to represent Yom HaShvi'i, day the seventh. Therefore you are to keep the Shabbat because it is holy for you. In Hebrew, it is HaShabbat, the Sabbath. It is holy. It is set apart for us to keep. But then that brings up another question. What does Shabbat mean? Well, it has come to mean the Sabbath, but its primary root seems to have the meaning of to cease. That's what Adonai did. He ceased from his work. But it also carries the implication of resting from the 6 days of labor. But Shabbat primarily means to cease from the normal labor which is done during the 6 days of work. That is what I believe it means for us. We are to cease from the work that we normally do during the week, our occupations, because Adonai ceased from his work on the seventh day. And this ties in with our not causing our manservant or our maidservant to work. because they would then be made to violate the Shabbat. They also need the rest and not to have to work 7 days a week. So this lets us know that we're not to buy or sell on Shabbat, because in buying, others will be made to work. But there are always exceptions. If we have a necessity, if our ox falls in the ditch, that is, if we have an emergency or a special need that could not be taken care of before or after Shabbat, then we buy on Shabbat. Speaking to the Pharisees, Yeshua said, Shabbat was made for man and not man for Shabbat. There's also a passage from the Talmud which says essentially the same thing. Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef said, for it, speaking of the Shabbat, is holy unto you. That is, it is committed into your hands, not you into its hands. Yoma 85b. While Adonai gave specific commands about Shabbat, he also made some exceptions. Keeping Shabbat is a way of pleasing Adonai, and it comes from a circumcised heart, a heart wishing to follow after Yeshua. Adonai gave further instructions about Shabbat in Leviticus 23. Then Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Bnei Israel and tell them, these are the appointed Moedim of Adonai, which you are to proclaim to be holy convocations, my Moedim. Work may be done for 6 days, but the 7th day is a Shabbat of solemn rest, a holy convocation, a Mikra Kodesh in Hebrew. You are to do no work. It is a Shabbat to Adonai in all your dwellings. And this tells us again that we are not to do our regular work on the 7th day, and that on the Shabbat we have a holy convocation, a Mikra Kodesh, a special time when we are to appear before Him. It is important that we attend services, these holy convocations, regularly and as often as possible. Even though we will not be put to death for violating Shabbat, Torah says that it is Adonai's penalty for us. According to Adonai, if we violate Shabbat, we are deserving of death. What this tells us is how important this day is in our Creator's eyes. What does our heart believe about Shabbat? If it is our genuine desire to keep Shabbat to the best of our ability, I don't believe that Adonai will judge us. He is merciful. Shabbat was made for man as a special day to honor our Creator's desire for us. It is something that we rejoice in and we take pleasure in, because we know that we are honoring His wishes. If we love the Lord our God with all our heart, all our mind, and all our strength, Shabbat will be important to us. Getting back to Purim. Purim is an ancient event which has much meaning for us today. Just as Esther's actions, which took place actually 2,492 years ago, just as her actions preserved Adonai's chosen people, so too are our actions important today. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Who knows whether you have attained royal status for such a time as this? Esther and Mordecai were an important part of Adonai's plan. Because of them, also because of the Maccabees, also because of countless others. Israel has been preserved over the centuries, despite Hasatan's effort to destroy God's chosen people. We are some of the modern Esthers, not in a royal court, but in our homes, in our synagogues, and in our communities. As Adonai has told us regarding Shabbat, it is a sign between me and Bnei Israel forever. It is that sign which identifies us as the people of the book. Hasatan has been very clever in downplaying Shabbat's importance. It's just a day. It's really not that important to God. Do whatever you want on Shabbat. And we are tempted to ignore what Adonai has clearly told us. Shabbat is a sign which we are to make visible to the world for such a time as this. There's no question in my mind that we are in the last of the last days. Adonai has restored Israel as a nation. Jerusalem is once again the capital of that nation and under Jewish control. Millions of Jews have made Aliyah in response to Adonai's call through the prophets. Isaiah calls out to us across the ages. Thus says Adonai, preserve justice, do righteousness, for my salvation is about to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Blessed is the one who does this, the Son of Man who takes hold of it, who keeps from profaning Shabbat, and keeps his hand from doing any evil. I think when Isaiah said that so long ago, he's really talking about our day. My salvation is about to come. Preserve mishpat and tzedakah, justice and righteousness. Tzedakah, righteousness or right standing before Adonai, is most important to us. Yeshua said, for I tell you that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and Torah scholars, you shall never enter the kingdom of heaven. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your strength, that we might do our part in bringing about salvation for the Jews and for the nations of the earth. Shabbat is the sign which identifies us as modern Esthers, followers of Adonai, those who respond to Adonai's call through the prophets. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Amen.
Amen.